Hey groupers, Pastor Marshall. I hope that you are ready to dig in to this second part of Acts chapter 2 as we continue to walk with the apostles through the book of Acts. Well, this last weekend we talked about the why questions that we get asked. And I wonder if, just to break the ice a little bit, if you would talk amongst each other in your group about what were some why questions you got asked this last week. Maybe you're a grandparent and your grandchild asked you a why question. Maybe you're a parent and your kids asked you a why question. Maybe you're a boss and your employees asked you a why question. Just share some why questions. For instance, this last week I was asked, why is the Catholic Bible different than our Bibles? Of course, what that person was referring to is there are some extra books in the Old Testament in the Catholic Bible. And so I explained to them that when the Bible was originally put together by the Council of Nicaea in 325, it was just like we have it today, 66 books. But the Roman Catholic Church added some books since that time. I don't always answer the why questions well, but at least this time, I think I did a pretty good job. Well, you talk about some why questions that you heard this last week. And then after that, I think that to begin with, it would be good for us to connect last week to this week. We chopped Acts chapter 2 in half, but it's really one big story. And so to begin with, just spend a little time talking about, catching everybody up, what happened last week. Why is Peter talking about drunkenness? And why does he concern himself with the time of the day? Just make sure everybody's caught up to speed as to what's happening. And then next, we have the apostles' message, the apostles' sermon, but we really focus on Peter as being the point man in this message. So the first thing that Peter does is he quotes from Joel chapter 2, verses 28 through 32. It says at the beginning of this passage that Joel quotes, "In the last days," which usually is language that the church uses to refer to the coming of Jesus, the second coming of Jesus, what we refer to as the end of the world. Well, that obviously can't be what Peter's talking about in this passage. So what is Peter talking about? He's talking about the Old Testament, and he's talking about the coming of the Holy Spirit. What's the Old Testament talking about when it says end of days? And while you're in this passage in Joel, I also think it's important to answer this question. When you're looking at Joel, make a note of who is Joel saying is included in the fulfillment of this prophecy. Does Joel say that anyone is excluded from the fulfillment of this prophecy? And why do you think that that would matter to Luke? Why would Luke make it such a point to put this whole quote in? Why would that be valuable to Luke, the author of the book of Acts? This past weekend, I broke this message down into 6 parts, Peter's message into 6 parts. So once again, in our groups, let's do the same thing because it makes it palpable, gives us some size pieces of meat that we can eat. So first, Jesus' life is mentioned in verse 22. What does Peter say about Jesus' life? Talk about that. And how do we know that they know about what Jesus did? Peter says, you know these things. How could they know these things that Jesus did? Then second, Peter mentioned Jesus' death in the next verse, in verse 23. What does Peter say about Jesus' death? Next, according to Peter, who is responsible for Jesus' death? And then finally, according to Peter, what was God's role in Jesus' death? Boy, you could spend a lot of time in verse 23. There is some deep, deep theology there as we talk about human responsibility and God's role. But we can't just stop there. That's only the second part. The third, we talk about Jesus' resurrection in verses 24 through 32. So, what does Peter say is the relationship between Jesus' death and Jesus? What does that mean? What is the relationship between death and Jesus? What does that mean? What does David say about Jesus' resurrection in Psalm 16? And then finally, why is it important that the apostles are telling this story? Why is it important that they're the ones sharing this message? Well, fourth, Peter talks about Jesus' exaltation in verses 33 through 36. He was restored to his right place in the universe. According to Peter, where is Jesus now? According to David, in Psalm 110, the most quoted psalm in the New Testament, this is the most quoted Old Testament passage in the New Testament, where is Jesus now? And according to Peter, who is Jesus now? And why is that important to us? Why is it important who Jesus is now to us? Well, fifth, Peter talks about Jesus' gift in verses 37 through 39. And so, according to Peter, there are two things that Jesus gives us when we believe in him. What are those two things? According to Peter, there are two things that we will do if we believe in Jesus. What are the two things that we will do if we believe in Jesus? And then, finally, sixth, Jesus' children in verses 40 and 41. We read about this huge crowd that believed in Jesus and were baptized that day. 3,000 plus. Remember, that's going to be in the Jewish world, men above the age of 21. It's not going to be counting women. It's not going to be counting children. Now, everybody know that we count women and children that get baptized at Lakeside Christian Church, but in those days, it wasn't exactly the same. Very significant. Well, every week, I challenge you to talk about what your favorite thing is in the passage, and then I also challenge you to talk about what did you not like. I'll be honest with you. What I like in this passage is I like the apostles' courage, their boldness. Remember, these are the guys that when they came to arrest Jesus, they ran for their lives. These are the guys that have been hidden in the upper room for the last 10 days. But the Holy Spirit has come, and now they are out telling everybody about Jesus. I really like that. What do I not like? Well, at the very end, it says those who accepted Jesus' message, and that means that there were those who didn't. And I don't like that. It boggles my mind that in the evidence of the resurrection of Jesus, people still wouldn't believe. Well, every week I also want to remind you of commitments that we made this last weekend. And I was challenged by this passage to preach about the life of Jesus first and foremost, and not to preach about life change first and foremost. I admit my own guilt, and I think the church is guilty too, that so many times we talk to people about the things that need to change in their life, or what we might say is wrong with their life. That's not what Peter and the apostles do. The focus is on Jesus, and then after people believe in Jesus, then we talk about change. I think I'm challenged to make sure that I just spend my time talking about Jesus. Well, I hope that you have a great group, and I will see you this next weekend as we continue our walk through the book of Acts.